Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's Energize Ohio short webinar presentation on-farm solar energy generation. Specifically today we're going to be looking at how to utilize PV solar systems to decrease grain drying cost. So, as we get started, just the initial question: how can photovoltaic solar systems be used to impact your grain drying costs? And the first, there's really 2 points that I like to start with, but first of all, I think it comes to whether or not you feel your energy prices are going to remain consistent for the next 15 to 20 years, or whether you're anticipating some increases in your per kilowatt hour cost. A couple of factors that could impact this are one, the amount of investments that we currently need to make in this country into energy or electricity generation, and two, the consumption and the demand for energy. A recent report from the U.S. Department of Energy in 2010 indicated that roughly 51% of the generation capacity in the United States is at least 30 years old. When you look specifically at coal-fired facilities, that number jumps to 73% that are 30 years or older. So one of the things that this suggests is that there's going to be a significant amount of investment that needs to be made into the generation fleet here in the U.S. So that certainly could impact future price per kilowatt hour of electricity. And the other we mentioned was the demand. And this is a chart from the U.S. Energy Information Administration that's analyzing global energy consumption, and this is total energy, so measured in quadrillion BTUs. And as you can see, there's clearly a trend line moving forward or upwards, and specifically from 1980 to 2010, there's more than an 80% increase from around 283 quadrillion BTUs in 1980 to right around 510 quadrillion BTUs in 2010. So when you really look at the total global energy consumption in 2010, that 510 quadrillion BTUs, in the U.S., we consume nearly 1/5 of that. So in 2010, the United States consumed 97.5 quadrillion BTUs. And of course, we support right around 4% of the global population. So clearly, energy is a significant issue here in the United States. So one way that farmers can possibly control these concerns over future energy cost and impacts is to actually invest in that type of energy generation on the farm. And this is an image that kind of illustrates what we're talking about today: on-farm or on-site electricity generation. So this is an image of two PV solar systems that are offsetting the electricity demands on the meter for the grain drying systems there on site. And as you can see, one of them is a rooftop system, the other is a ground mount. So today's presentation is going to help walk through the process of the initial idea: does on-farm or distributed energy generations make sense for my facilities and my operations, and help you work through the process of trying to determine whether or not this is an investment that makes sense for you and for your specific operations. We're going to start out by having a brief overview on renewable energy policy. We'll look at net metering, analyze photovoltaic solar or PV solar as a technology and how it works. Some considerations for site assessments and sizing a system. Analyzing economics, costs, what are the costs, what are the means of paying off this type of a project. And then we'll look at a couple of case studies and analyze how these types of systems have successfully been developed in Ohio. So, getting started, we'll take a look at renewable energy policy in Ohio. Senate Bill 228 was passed in 2008, and it housed the state's first alternative energy portfolio standards. Many refer to this as 25 by 25, or 25% alternative energy generation by the year 2025. Now, this specifically applies to the state's investor-owned utilities, and as you look at alternative energy generation, or the 25% alternative energy generation, half of that has to come from, or I should say half of that can come from advanced energy sources. The other half can come from renewable energy sources. So renewable energy includes the technology we're talking about today: photovoltaic, solar, and of course wind, bioenergy, some of those types of technologies. Advanced energy sources refers to clean coal technologies, third generation nuclear, those types of technologies. Now, the 25 by 25 is made up of a couple of different percentages. So, as we mentioned, the existing baseline generation could come from existing coal facilities, natural gas plants, nuclear plants, hydroelectric, so forth. The alternative energy is made up of both advanced energy and renewable, and as we mentioned, a minimum of half has to come from renewable. More could come from renewable, but at least 12.5% must be renewable technologies. And of the renewable portion, 0.5% must come from solar energy. That's referred to as the solar carve-out. Now, of the renewable portion, half of the renewable portion must be located or physically located in the state of Ohio. The other half could be energy that's purchased from a neighboring state. One of the reasons that the alternative portfolio standards are important is because it in a sense creates a market for renewable energy in Ohio, and is one of the reasons why there's a market for distributed energy systems, or what we're referring to in this application as on-farm energy systems, because utilities have a policy that's mandating they purchase a certain percentage of renewable energy. They have two ways to do that. They can either own the facility and own, of course, the electricity and the renewable energy or green energy attributes from that project, or they could purchase renewable energy credits, or in the case of solar, a solar energy credit from a broker or from specific systems that are certified through the state's Ohio Power Siting Board as a certified renewable energy facility in Ohio. So we'll get into SRECs, or solar renewable energy credits, a little later in this webinar. Next, we're going to talk about net metering. If you're an electric utility customer in Ohio and you're interested in generating your own electricity on site, the good news is Ohio law allows you to do that, provided that you meet some criteria. Some of the main criteria is to make sure that the electricity that you're producing is intended to offset a portion of or all of your on-site electricity requirements, but not necessarily becoming a net generator of electricity. So you want to design a system to offset a specific meter, but not more than what you're going to use on that meter. The generating equipment needs to be located on your own premises or your property. And for net metering, it needs to be connected in parallel with the electric utility system. Net metering is really a tool. So we discussed earlier, we referred to on-site generation. There's a couple of different, depending on who you're talking to, as to how this is referred to. On-site generation is also referred to as distributed energy generation systems. What distributed energy is referring to in this case is smaller on-site systems that are on your premises, as we discussed earlier, and intended to offset your electrical demands. So for the purposes of this webinar, we're referring to distributed energy systems as on-farm energy systems. Net metering is a tool that allows that to happen. Net metering is a billing arrangement between the customer and the utility that allows them to export any additional energy that's generated back onto the grid. So regardless of when your system is generating the energy or when you're consuming it, at the end of the billing cycle, you're only billed for the net difference. Another way to look at this is to kind of think of the utilities grid is the bank. And so if you're generating kilowatt hours of electricity, you can kind of think of that as additional income. If you're fortunate enough to have additional income, you go deposit it in the bank. Well, here you're generating excess kilowatt hours, you're depositing them into the grid, and you're getting credit for those. And so you can build up these credits, and then as you have a month where you may not be generating as much energy with your system and you're using more, you can draw that credit. You can draw those kilowatt hours back from the grid and of course get credit for those during your billing cycle. A couple things to consider with net metering. Net metering is a credit that it's limited to your kilowatt hour charges only. So it's important to remember, or really, it's important to understand your bill, and note that net metering system is going to be offsetting the generation charges, but not necessarily some of the other charges that may exist on your bill, such as delivery, distribution, transmission charges, stuff of that nature. Also, rural electric cooperatives and municipal electric utilities in Ohio are not required under Senate Bill 221 to provide net metering. Now, many of them do, and so what I would encourage you to do if you're in a rural cooperative territory is to just contact your cooperative and discuss the project with you and see what it is that they do offer for net metering. One of the things that I found talking with a number of farmers who have installed systems and also some developers here in Ohio is that it seems a lot of the rural cooperatives that are in the Touchstone Energy Network do offer net metering, but have a system's capacity limit of 100 kilowatt. This is just a chart that kind of illustrates the growing trend of net metering systems in Ohio, and actually the trends likewise nationwide. If you look at the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration, they had a report out that showed net metering trends from 2003 to 2010, and nationwide it grew by an average of 56% annually. A significant portion of that growth was located in California, but as you can see here in Ohio, since 2007, we've seen significant growth in this area. Now, when we look at 2010, there were 757 net metering projects in Ohio. One of the things I wanted to do specific to this application was try and determine, what percentage of that 757 is located on the farm. And to do this, I utilized the 2009 U.S. Department of Agriculture's Renewable Energy Survey, where they did a national survey of farms that had renewable energy systems and actually determined, how many of them were solar, how many of them were wind, based off of the survey results. And so in Ohio, they're projecting that there was right around 115 farms that had on-farm solar systems. And so when we applied the on-farm wind and on-farm solar to that 757 net metering projects, you could see almost 21% of the net metering projects in Ohio in 2010 are estimated to be located on the farm and in on-farm applications. So I think that we're going to see more and more of this type of development moving forward with agricultural facilities. Next, we're going to discuss a little bit about the technology of photovoltaic solar. I think this is an interesting quote that I heard during a webinar with the University of Nebraska. It took about 5 billion years to store up the energy in our current hydrocarbon fossil fuels, and in comparison, it takes about 20 days of sun exposure to to get that same amount of energy from sunlight. So, as many of you in the agricultural sector are aware of, the sun is a significant resource, and you're in the business of harvesting the sun's energy just in a different manner. This chart is how it's illustrating how most of us currently get our electricity. It's through a centralized model where we have a centralized generation at large power stations where we're generating hundreds of megawatts of energy and transmitting it through our transmission system at a very high voltage to a local distribution substation where the voltage is then reduced and it's distributed on our local distribution networks to our homes, farms, businesses where that electricity is consumed. An alternative to that is to look at it from a distributed energy generation approach, or in our case, on-farm energy generation. And as you can see in the image to the left there, there's a solar panel on the rooftop of that house. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. It's a smaller system located on site to satisfy the electricity needs for that specific home. When we talk about photovoltaic or PV solar, it's important to note that we're talking about generating electricity from the sun's light energy, not heat energy. And so when we look at the word photovoltaic, it's photon, photo, light, and voltaic, electricity. So photovoltaic. The basic building block of a PV material is the solar cell, and a series of solar cells are wired together and fixed within a rigid frame to generate or create a solar module, which you see indicated there in the picture. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as a solar panel. The top right picture is illustrating some a number of different solar modules or panels, and as you can see, they come in a variation of sizes and shapes and configurations. Now, solar panels or modules are wired together to create a solar array. On the bottom right hand picture, you can see a much larger configuration and that racking system that builds a solar array. And that specific array is located in Wyandotte County at the Wyandotte Solar Project on their airport. And that array has 50 modules connected to make up that one array. There's a number of different materials that are used for solar panels or PV panels. The traditional material is a crystalline silicon panel, and it's typically a flat plate panel ranging in an output range from 175 to 250 watt is fairly common. Today there's even panels that are 300, 305 watt panels. So the technology is very fluid and always changing. Your crystalline panels are typically more efficient than the second generation panel, which is thin film. Thin film panels are made from a non-silicon material such as cadmium telluride. Thin film panels are very thin in nature, only a few micrometers thick, and typically they're thin and flexible, so they can be integrated into building materials a little bit better, such as your rooftop shingles or tiles, window panels in buildings and so forth. So the PV solar effect, how does it work? Very generally speaking, you can kind of picture this as a silicon sandwich. On the bottom, you have a piece of bread that's a positively charged layer of silicon. On the top, it's sandwiched with a negatively charged layer. And so as the sun's light, and once again, it's the sun's light energy, hits the panel, it knocks loose the electrons from the silicon atoms, creating a positively and negatively charged effect that's an internal field, which ultimately flows through the cell to where the load is. And so once again, this is how photovoltaic solar uses the sun's light energy to generate electricity. Obviously, the PV or solar panel is probably the most prominent or well-known piece of a PV system. The remaining components to that PV system are often referred to as the balance of system. Balance of system is going to include components such as inverters, which will convert the electricity from a direct current, which your panel is going to generate, into an alternating current. You're going to have your meters, safety equipment, disconnect switches, lockouts, and so forth. In the event that you would have a system that has a battery system integrated into it, you're going to have batteries and charge controllers as well. Some benefits of solar energy include energy independence. A lot of times we hear this referred to on the national level, but I think that there's also something to be said for having that at the residential level or on your farm as well, to know that you're controlling your future energy costs. And it is an environmentally friendly technology. It can be developed very quickly. It's a free fuel source, so once that initial capital outlay is recovered, there's no charge for the fuel source. There's no futures market for sunlight. Minimal maintenance. There are very few, if any, moving parts in solar. As a result, many of the systems are, the inverters are, can be warranted for 10 to 15 years, and the panels themselves can be warranted for 20 to 25 years. And the systems are easily expanded upon, so you don't necessarily have to start out trying to neutralize your entire meter. Maybe you want to start out with a smaller percentage of it and see how it works, and then if you're comfortable with that, you can always go back and expand on the system later. Some challenges with solar. Solar cells do not store energy, so it's important that the systems are sized accordingly. And as we discussed net metering earlier, because PV solar systems, as many renewable systems, do not store energy, net metering is a critical component to making these types of projects work. The performance is dependent upon sunlight. Cost, and I have a question mark here because this is also a factor that's rather fluid, and 10 years ago cost was much more of a challenge than what it is today. The U.S. Department of Energy has a Sunshot initiative that is geared towards really dropping the installed cost per watt of solar, and I believe their target is $2.75 per watt. It's $2.75 or $2.50, somewhere in that range. But to give you an idea, for mid-sized systems between 10 kilowatt and 100 kilowatt, the installed cost per watt has dropped by 6 to 7% annually since 2000. Where in 2000 it was more than $10 per watt installed cost, and that's dropped to where in 2012 the installed cost per watt was down to $4.62 per watt, and those are national averages as well. So, while cost is still higher than some other sources of electricity, it does have its benefits, and the cost is coming down to where these systems are now being installed on a number of homes, businesses, and farms. Next few slides, we're going to look at some considerations for site assessments and how to size a system. Some questions to ask yourself as you're getting started. Is there zoning in my township that could impact this type of development? Am I even allowed to do some type of on-site generation with zoning? What types of systems will my utilities allow? Are there capacity limits with the utility? Does the technology that I'm looking at work with the utility system that I'm in? Also, as I mentioned earlier, understanding your utility bill and what tariff you're on, the various riders and charges that may be on your bill, and how a net metering system could impact that. What is your cost per kilowatt hour of electricity? And I would recommend tracking that backwards. So, what's the trend? Do I have a strong belief that electricity prices are going to go up, or have I experienced, possibly a reduction in my cost per kilowatt hour? And then also, do you have access to the natural resource where you need it? Within the configurations of your property, do you have good sunlight resource? Some other questions, and specifically related to the sunlight resources. Do you have a south-facing roof? Is there enough space on your rooftop to do panels, or would you be considering a ground mount type system? Is there any shading in the ground or roof area where you're wanting to put this type of a system? What's the angle? Is the roof in good condition? As we mentioned earlier, some of these systems, the panels could be warranted for 20, 25 years. You don't want to invest in a PV rooftop system that's going to last 25 years if you're expecting to make some upgrades to your roof, or you need to do maintenance in the next 10 years. Property line setbacks. If you're considering a ground mount system, think about the property. Especially if you're in a parent parcel that some farms have yet to be subdivided. While the dryers or the barns may exist based on where you're mowing and where you're turning dirt, that property line might not exist at the tax map office. So think about how you are actually going to subdivide that property if you've not already done so, in terms of where you would locate this system. Because as we indicated earlier, you want to make sure that the panel is located on the property of the meter that you're going to be offsetting. Solar orientation. Being in Ohio here in the northern hemisphere, we want our solar panels to face south. If we were, say we were located in Australia, it would be the exact opposite. We would want our panels in that case to face north. But here in Ohio, northern hemisphere, we want the solar orientation of our panels to be facing south to maximize their efficiency. Now, as you can see in the image here, it kind of shows the solar path of the sun in the summer compared to the winter months, which could impact the tilt to maximize the efficiency. So sometimes you hear installers discussing the angle of your panels. Now, as a general rule of thumb, you'll hear developers talk about installing a panel at the angle that would be the same as your latitude. So in Ohio, we'll be looking at 40, 41 degrees. And of course, there's a number of different factors that will impact that in terms of, if it's a ground mount or rooftop system. If it's a rooftop system, many times they will just mount the panels flat, and so you'll go with whatever angle it is that your rooftop may be. Assuming that it's not flat. Flat panels or flat rooftops present some challenges with solar because if the panels are laying flat, then in the winter months the snow could just pile up, and with no angle, the snow is less likely to slide off of those panels. But as you can see in the image here, this rooftop panel is at 45, and that's what they put the panel at. Another benefit to having them flat, more so than just an aesthetic reason, would be to minimize the impact from wind, from a wind load on a system, by having it mounted flat. Now, if you do have a system that is either a tracking system, or if it's a system that you can actually adjust the tilt on, like a ground mount system that's not fixed that you could adjust. Sometimes systems will be tweaked or adjusted in the summer and winter months to maximize efficiencies. In the summer, you're going to want to take your latitude minus 10 to 15 degrees to maximize the efficiency. And in the winter months, you would take that latitude tilt and add 10 to 15 degrees to maximize the efficiency. Space requirements. A very conservative general rule of thumb would be 100 square feet of space is needed for every kilowatt of electricity produced. And once again, this is just a general consideration to help you try and understand, what type of space you may need on your farm. One of the things I like to point out as well is think about the grade of your property, specifically if you're envisioning a ground mount system. As you see in the picture there's shadows beneath the panels. And so if the grade of your property is grading to the north, you're going to have to space the rows of those panels further apart to prevent a row in the front from shading a row in the back. So you want to make sure that you don't have a slope that would be facing to the north, or that could present some challenges that would cause you to add additional space to generate the same amount of energy. Other considerations on the farm would include trees, of course. This is an image of a hog facility that you can see is nestled within the trees, and the red line there is representing a 75-foot setback. The yellow line's a 150-foot setback. The same would apply if you had a grain dryer meter that you were looking to neutralize if there are trees in the way. You just need to consider how those trees are going to impact where you'd locate your system, trying to get access to that southern sky. A couple of developers I've talked to have mentioned that as kind of a guiding point. They reference taking a tree's mature height and then having a minimum setback of 1.5 times the tree's mature height from the base of the tree to where you would locate a panel. And once again, that's just kind of doing an eyeball test on a site. What you really want to try to avoid is having any shading where you would put the panels between the hours of, say, 9 in the morning till 3 or 4 in the evening. But as you work through the process and identify a developer that you're comfortable working with, most developers are going to have some type of a solar eye or a sun eye as a shading tool that they'll bring on site and really get some detailed data in terms of what the shading impact would be for that location. Solar resource. This is a slide that I wanted to use to kind of illustrate how the solar resource of your location can impact the production of your facility. And so here we're comparing the solar resource of 5.2 kilowatt hours per square meter per day in Florida compared to Seattle. And you can see it was 5.2 in Miami, Florida, and 3.7 in Seattle. And of course, these numbers are provided by the National Renewable Energy Laboratories. But you can see that when you calculate the same system out based off of the solar resource, you're getting significantly more energy or electricity from the project in Miami compared to Seattle. This map shows nationwide kind of the solar resource in a color-coded chart, and I know it's somewhat difficult to read, and so the next slide will provide you some detailed benchmarks here in Ohio. But I just thought it's kind of neat to look at it from a nationwide perspective as to where does Ohio fit in terms of how do they compare to the rest of the U.S. And I also like to point out you see Alaska there, which has in terms of the U.S. The weakest solar resource. Germany worldwide has traditionally been the largest producer and consumer of solar energy globally, and they have a solar resource that would be comparable to that of Alaska. So, when some people ask, do we have an adequate resource here in Ohio to make these types of projects work? And I think the answer is yes. It's been proven not only here in Ohio, but in other areas throughout the world that have less of a resource, but have been very successful in developing projects to produce electricity. And as I mentioned, here's a chart that shows the average monthly solar radiation in some of the Ohio cities, that you can kind of find one that you're closest to and use that resource. I did provide also the web link where you can go to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory website to look at some of this information on your own. So, how do you calculate your own system size? So, if you're looking at your farm and your operation, and you're thinking, I'm kind of interested in this, but not enough to the point where I feel comfortable contacting a developer or contacting my utility, you can really get some interesting information just with that solar resource that I showed in the previous slide, and then taking a calculator and your utility bills and playing with some numbers to see, what size of a system would you be looking at on your farm, and how could that system impact your bill, and do you have enough space and location to support that type of development. So what we're going to do is take the 10-step guide, which is a guide that's really been modified from two sources. One from the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Laboratory, and also from the E3A Energy Efficiency and Alternatives Energy Kit that was developed as a SARE initiative by Montana State University Extension and the University of Wyoming Extension. So the 10 steps here are to take your monthly kilowatt hours used, and one of the things that I would kind of encourage farmers to do is do a little bit of additional digging, especially if you're looking at applying this to the meter for a grain bin system, because as you know, there's certain years where we dry more than what we dry the other years. So you want to make sure that you account for that variation in terms of year-to-year energy consumption based on how much you dry the crops. So we'll take our monthly average and multiply that by 1,000 to get watt hours in a month. Divide by 30 to get total kilowatt hours used in an average day. Account for any energy efficiencies that we may be integrating, and then we're going to multiply by our target. So in step number 5, we're going to want to see, what is our goal in terms of that specific meter? Do you want to offset 50% of that meter? Do you want to offset 80% of the meter, 100% of the meter? For the purposes of the calculations I used 80%. Then we'll divide by that solar radiation for the city that we identified in the previous slide. To account for inefficiencies in the system, we're going to multiply by 1.2, and then we'll divide by 1,000 to get back into kilowatt hours. And to determine how many panels you want, what we can do is divide by the peak wattage of a panel. So I mentioned, a common panel is a 250 watt panel right now, so we could use 250 watt there in step 9. And what that's going to do is estimate us the size of the system we would need, and then also the amount of panels that it would take to generate that amount of electricity. This is a chart that kind of walks through an example with those steps we just went through. So I used a monthly kilowatt hours of 4,167. And what I did, and we'll see in the next slide, I actually contacted a farmer that had installed a rooftop solar system on his hog barn. And I said, could you just provide me with your annual energy usage? So how many kilowatt hours did you use in a season? And I came up with their monthly average, and from that ran through these calculations to see how close would the calculations using this process come to what their developer actually presented them with and ultimately developed, because as I mentioned, the system has been up and running for 6 to 8 months now. And so when we look at the comparison, you can see that it was relatively close. The system size that we came up with using this project estimator was 31.7 kilowatt, and their actual system that they developed was 29.25. So we were very close. They utilized 117 panels in their system, and we were projecting around 127. So, and in my mind, you're going to want an estimator or a calculator to be on the conservative side as well, on the conservative side, as well. So, I think that it was very close in this example. And then one of the areas where we were off with our estimations was with the cost. And I would caution anyone to put a whole lot of validity into this type of a cost estimate. But what I did was took the system size and actually applied we referenced earlier the U.S. Department of Energy Sunshot Initiative, where they said nationwide the average installed cost per watt for mid-size systems was $4.62. So I used that number, and as you can see, it was significantly higher than the actual installed cost of the system here in Ohio. So anyhow, it's a process that I think if you want to play with some numbers, on your farm and without having any real commitment, you can kind of see what size system, what would a potential cost be before you contact a developer or utility moving forward. This is a very critical slide in my opinion. Interconnecting an on-site or on-farm generation system with the utilities grid can present a number of issues and challenges, and it needs to be considered before investing in this type of project. And so I haven't said it yet, but I want to take a moment to say it very clearly that the first step should be to contact your local electric utility provider and discuss your plans with them, review your plans with them. Even if you've already contacted a developer, or if a developer's contacted you, I still encourage you to make sure that you have a conversation with your utility so that you're understanding what some of the challenges may be from their perspective as well. That's not to say after you have some conversations with your utility that the developer will kind of take over that role and do do a lot of the administrative work and some of the paperwork and the applications to obtain the paperwork necessary. But initially, I think that it's important that the actual project owner, the property owner, needs to have that conversation. And as mentioned, you really need to understand what tariff are you on, what are the various charges on your bill. And how all of this is going to impact, how this type of development is going to impact your utility bill. Some considerations from a utility's perspective, and what I did to develop this slide was had a phone call with a couple of utilities to just see, are there any bullet points that you would recommend including in a presentation to farmers or businesses that are considering this type of project. And this is just a summary of that, and obviously there's a variation amongst the different utilities, but a couple of bullet points I pulled from is that an interconnection application must be submitted to the utility provider. So with net metering, you're talking about entering the utility's grid, and to do that you really need to have an application to do so, because there's serious safety considerations both to the line workers that are potentially working on the grid, and also to the equipment itself. Understanding your tariff and how it's going to impact your bill. We discussed earlier, capacity cannot exceed that of the utility's facilities, and so if so, there could be some additional cost to your project to bring the grid up to the capacity that would need to be to support your system. And once again, that could apply to some projects and it may not apply to others, but those are questions that you need to have that initial conversation with with your utility and also your developer. And then understanding the rules to permitting and integrating these installations onto the grid. An example would be having a utility accessible and lockable disconnect switch for the generator, and that would be in the instance that the utility has to provide or perform some type of maintenance to the grid to make sure that they can disconnect your system so it's not feeding electricity onto a distribution grid that they're trying to provide maintenance on. Once again, a lot of these bullet points and these factors the developer is going to address, but it's important that the farmer, the system owner, understand them as well. Economics and costs. So the next few slides we're going to kind of look at what are some of the considerations in terms of system costs and payback. So system costs and payback simplified, and nothing's really simplified when you're talking about this type of an investment, but and trying to do so, we can look at there's really two things on the investment side. So there's typically a high upfront capital investment that needs to be laid out to develop these projects. It's a high installation cost. But one of the benefits of that is down the road then, once you recover that initial capital outlay, there's no ongoing fuel cost to purchase the fuel. As we mentioned earlier, the sunlight is free. Operations and maintenance costs with solar are relatively low compared to other types of generating technologies because there's very few moving parts. And so then on the system's payback, the ones that we're going to talk about today are going to include the 30% federal investment tax credit, solar renewable energy credits, a reduction in electricity purchased from your utility, and system depreciations. There are other funding programs available that some farmers here in Ohio have utilized and utilized successfully. Most notably probably is the USDA's REAP grant program, the Rural Energy for America program. Some developers will actually apply for those grants for you. So, but I don't want to include that in this discussion because that is a competitive grant program, and I want to kind of look at this from a conservative approach. And so if you get that, that's good. It will increase the system's payback, but I don't want to assume that because once again, it is competitive. You would also want to check with maybe your utilities to see if they have specific programs. And then currently here in Ohio, there's, the Ohio Energy Office has an Ohio Energy Loan Fund that has been utilized in some instances. So first, as we mentioned, is the federal energy investment tax credit. The ITC program offers a 30% tax credit, which is really presenting investors with a dollar for dollar reduction in your federal tax liability. This is good if you have an appetite for tax credits, and as noted there in the bullet points, it can be carried back 1 year, or it can also be carried forward 20 years. I would encourage you, if you're considering this on your farm, to discuss it with your accountant, or if you do your own books, there's a link to the Form 3468 with some more details on this program. A couple of considerations with the investment tax credit would be, the 5-year compliance period, and you'll find these located in that form 3468 that I have referenced there. But a couple things is to think about if there's a change in ownership that would occur in that 5-year period, and then also if the property ceases to be a qualified energy facility, there could be a recapture of that credit triggered. So just a couple of things to consider in terms of moving forward to make sure that you don't envision a change in ownership for the property within the next 5 years. So while many of you are probably familiar with investment tax credits, I could assume that many of you may not be as familiar with solar renewable energy credits, often referred to as SRECs. So a solar renewable energy credit is going to represent the environmental attributes from a solar system. So if you have an on-farm photovoltaic solar system, that system is going to generate essentially two things. It's going to generate electricity, so you're going to have kilowatt hours you're generating, assuming that the sun's shining. And you're also going to generate renewable energy credits. And so, as noted in the bullet point there, a renewable energy credit is going to be generated for every megawatt hour of energy, or 1,000 kilowatt hours. Your system is going to continue to generate SRECs for the life of the project, and so it's conceivable to think that you're going to generate SRECs throughout the 20-25 year lifespan of your project. Now, in Ohio, we noted that there's a alternative energy portfolio standards where our utilities are trying to generate a certain percentage of their generation portfolio from renewable energy technologies. And we mentioned earlier they can do that by either A, developing and owning a project that generates renewable energy, or they could purchase renewable energy credits or solar energy credits to meet that demand. In Ohio, an SREC has a lifetime of 5 years after the acquisition. So system owners have a number of different opportunities to buy or sell these SRECs based off of their systems in Ohio. And we're going to get into that in a couple slides here. But first I wanted to discuss how do you determine what an SREC is valued at? And there's no assigned value to a solar renewable energy credit, but it's kind of determined based off of the supply, so how many SRECs are available, and then also what is the mandate, so our policy mandate, and then combined with the compliance penalty. So in this slide, we're showing the solar alternative compliance payment, and you can see the schedule on the chart there. And in 2014 it is right around $300 per megawatt hour that a utility who's out of compliance would have to pay. And so those factors are all going to kind of influence what the value of an SREC is. And it's you can go on some of the websites. One I'll reference here in just a minute is the PJM, which is our regional transmission organizer or operator, and they have a website that really tracks how SRECs are trading and what the prices are. But it's it's very up and down, as you may imagine. And one of the things that I've seen with systems installed on businesses and farms is that farmers and businesses are not necessarily in the business of trying to sell these credits, and so they've opted to work with their developers or work with a broker to offload this SRECs up front and go on with their business versus trying to sell them as they're generated. But how do you sell them? And as I mentioned, if a system owner decides that they want to sell the credits as they generate them, they have that ability. A couple of resources there, as I mentioned, you go to the PJM website listed at the bottom bullet point, and there's a couple of bulletin boards. There's a buyer bulletin board, a Gantt bulletin board, where you can see RFPs that are put out for SRECs, or if you want to post yours, you can do that. Or you can work with an aggregator or a broker to offload your SRECs. Or, as I mentioned, some developers actually offer in the proposal that they work with you on where they'll actually purchase those. They may hold on to those as a company, or their company may have a broker that they work with where they purchase all the SRECs and then sell them to that broker. So a couple of different options, but it's certainly something that you want to consider because it impacts the financial model of your project. One thing I will note, if the developer does buy your SRECs, and as I mentioned, some of the developers will actually buy all of the environmental attributes from your project up front. So they'll have a formula and they'll say, here's the number we're going to offer you up front, whether it's in the form of a SREC grant or an SREC rebate, but it's upfront cash that developer would provide to you. And in return, they get all of the SRECs your system would generate over the next 25 years. One of the things that will do is it really is a way that developer now has a vested interest in the performance, the ongoing performance of your system. And so, they're not generating SRECs unless your system's generating kilowatt hours. And so, some developer or some farmers I've talked to said, we're comfortable with this because, in a sense, the developer has a stake in this system performing well over the next 25 years. Project depreciation and taxation. The on-site solar generation does not qualify for Section 179 tax treatment, and actually the bonus depreciation has recently sunset. So as of right now, you're going to be looking at a straight line depreciation over a 5-year period. On the taxation side, these projects are exempt from personal property tax, state sales tax, and so you don't need to worry about paying additional taxes on property's increased value, which is of course going to save you money year over year. So that's kind of a summary of some of the cost and taxation considerations. Next few slides, we're going to look at a few case studies in terms of the the generation and the consumption of energy, and also some of the costs associated with these projects. And the first one is a rather large project, but it's a grain dryer in Seneca County that's going to install a 140 kilowatt system, and as I mentioned, is going to install. So this project will be built in the spring of 2014 by a company by the name of EcoGiva Solar. And the farmer and the developer were willing to provide some data for this webinar to help illustrate to others, how net metering can work with a grain dryer meter. And as I mentioned, this is a very large project. It's a 140 kilowatt system. I would say an average with some of the solar systems I've seen in Ohio and in Michigan on grain dryers, instead of a 140 kilowatt system, a 40 kilowatt system would probably be more of the norm in terms of on-farm. This specific system, has these dryers have a holding capacity of over 500,000 bushels, so clearly a commercial application here. But nonetheless, I think the next few charts will help demonstrate how net metering works. So here you can see the gross system cost of $822,000. Assuming that you have that tax appetite, there's a 30% investment tax credit, which, as we mentioned, that $252,000, it could be applied with a 1-year look back, or it could be carried forward up to 20 years. Tax effect of $180,000. This specific project, the developer offered an upfront payment for all of the SRECs. That payment equaled out to be $280,000, so it's a one-time payment, and they get all of the SRECs for this project over the life of the project. They have a projected payback of 4.3 years, and here they also, they presented the farmer with a electricity savings of $1.2 million over 25 years. Now, I put this here, and I kind of wanted to point this out. I would encourage you, if a developer presents you with some type of a calculations on electricity savings, to ask what the assumptions were. And as you can see here, I highlighted them. The assumptions were 10% escalation rate for 10 years, and then flat. And so, I've seen some escalation calculations that were higher. I've seen some that were lower. Seems like a lot of calculations are in the 3 to 4% escalation range, but then they'll carry that 3 to 4% for the entire 25 years. So one question may be, can you run a couple of different estimates? Could you run me electricity savings based on today's cost and no escalation? And then maybe you run an escalation at 4%, and then you run one at 10%. So you kind of have a best, worst, and medium case scenario. Moving forward, this chart is showing the electricity consumption over a 12-month period. So this was actually their consumption in 2012. Now, I would encourage you to, as I mentioned earlier, take a couple of years into account when you're looking at a dryer, and at least make sure that you look at a year when maybe you didn't have to dry a crop as much versus a year where you had to run the dryers a lot, and try and come up with a true average to account for that annual variation. But here you can see, as expected, rather flat until we get into the fall season, and in September and October we really kind of ramp up our usage. Compared to our generation over a 12-month period here, we can see the system's going to generate a little bit more in the summer months than it would in the winter. And of course, think back to the chart that illustrated the solar's path, or the sunlight path, where we have more sunlight hours in the summer. But you can see that it's rather consistent, but a little bit heavier in the summer months. What's interesting or telling is when we do an overlay of the two charts. So here we can see in gray where our system is generating electricity, and in red where we're consuming electricity. Now, you can see the gray area there where in the months leading up to September, we're actually generating more energy or more electricity than what we're using. And so that's where we're going to be depositing those kilowatt hours back to the grid. We're feeding those back into the utilities grid, and getting credit for that electricity that we're generating but not using. And then we get into September and October when our consumption of electricity is going to ramp up while we're drying material more frequently. And of course, our system's not going to be able to keep up with that increase in demand. And so then what we're doing is you're going to be importing energy from the grid to make up for that variation or that difference where you need more energy than what you're generating. But with net metering, the good part of net metering is if you've built this credit up throughout the year, so now you're going to be drawing down on that credit as needed during the drying season. So hopefully this chart will help kind of illustrate how you're generating and exporting energy onto the grid and then drawing it back when you need it a little more clearly. As mentioned, that case study was a very large system, a 140 kilowatt system. A lot of on-farm applications could be very, much smaller. This is an example up in Norwalk, Ohio, of a 15 kilowatt rooftop system that was installed. And talking with the developer that built this, they mentioned that they've done I think 102 systems in Ohio and in Michigan. In 2013, I think they contracted 8 systems on farms here in Ohio. And the average, I guess first point being, is they said that with agricultural applications, grain drying meters seem to be the most common, followed by animal housing. It said next would be kind of hog barn operations and then some dairy. But grain dryers were the most common, and they said the most common size is right around a 50 kilowatt. So to give you some point of reference, that's kind of what we're seeing out there on other farms. Another point that I thought was interesting was they said from 102 customers, 17 of those have already came back and added capacity to existing systems. So after they built a system and became comfortable with it and how it was working and saw what it was producing, and how much of the meter they were offsetting, they came back and actually added to those systems to to increase the amount of energy that they were generating on site. This is another application altogether. This is a picture from a hog barn that has a rooftop solar system that's right around a 30 kilowatt system. It offsets 80% of the meter and has 117 panels. Their annual usage was 54,000 kilowatt hours, and the rooftop systems here panels here were actually not mounted flat. So we talked about how some of the panels were just mounted flat. Here they used a 35-degree tilt to maximize the efficiency at this specific location. Talking with that farmer, he was very pleased with the system. He said that he actually worked out a SREC agreement with the utility, where the utility purchased all of the SRECs from that system. I believe it was over the next 15 or 20 years. And that farmer said that initially the system, they were kind of forecasting a 4.5 year payback. And he said he doesn't think that they're going to hit that, but in his estimation, he said we should fall in the 5-year range in terms of a break-even point, but it would certainly be within the 6th year. And so, his comment was, to me, that makes sense. He said it's the system has a 25-year warranty on the panels, a 15-year warranty on the inverters, so a 5 or 6 year payback period is certainly acceptable. To the point where he went ahead and that picture that I just showed was on a 2,400 head facility. He had a separate facility that was a 2,400 head unit, and he put a separate system on that facility to offset that meter. And then he went back and put a third system on his barn, on his workshop, to offset that meter as well. So another example of someone who once they became comfortable with it went ahead and continued to expand their development. This specific chart, that farmer provided me all of his generation data. He logged it daily from June of 2013 when they installed it, and when I had the data was through December. So you can see here it's kind of tracking the daily generation. And of course you can start to see, there's a lot of variation, and as we mentioned, the photovoltaic technology is very dependent on the sun's light energy. So some days are more overcast than others, and you can see that here. And as a large kind of trends. You can start to see where, in June, July, August, September, there's very good sun resource, and then we get to October, and that starts to taper off a little bit. And then I calculated the average daily usage as kind of a straight line metric to compare the daily generation with. So I thought that was interesting as well. Well, I hope that today's webinar has provided you with some information to help increase your initial knowledge on this type of a technology, and specifically this type of an application, utilizing on-farm photovoltaic solar technologies to offset a portion of your facility's costs. Some additional resources I would encourage you to look at. We do have Energize Ohio folders with some worksheets available. If you're in attendance today, you can grab those. If not, if you're listening to this on a webcast, feel free to email us through the Energize Ohio website listed there and request some materials, or simply give us a call, and we'd be happy to talk with you. Other resources, I would encourage you to look at the USDA's website. They have a report on solar energy use in U.S. agriculture. A very useful report specific to the agricultural sector. And then in Ohio, we have the Public Utilities Commission website, where they have some nice reference materials related to net metering. You can also find contacts for all of the utilities. Most of our utilities have someone that is specifically dedicated to help you through the process of net metering or distributed generation systems. So all of the utilities contacts are kind of aggregated on the PUCO's website, so I'd encourage you to visit that as well. And as I mentioned, if you want to get a hold of me, my contact number is here, along with email address. So once again, I thank you for attending, and look forward to talking with you in the future on this specific topic related to energy and agriculture. Thanks again. Have a good day.